Hello, it's week 4 of English 340. This week we're finishing off Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and we're going to be talking about the General Prologue of the Canterbury Tales of Geoffrey Chaucer, and also the Wife of Bath's Prologue. So this video is just a short backgrounder on Chaucer, and we're going to talk about the famous opening lines of the General Prologue as well. Now, Chaucer was somebody we know a lot more about than the poet of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He is not anonymous. We, in fact, know more about Chaucer's life than we do about Shakespeare, strangely enough. Or maybe it's not that strange. He was closely attached to royal circles. He was from a wealthy family. He had fought as a soldier when he was a teenager with King Edward III in the 100 Years' War. And he worked as a major official in the government. And was a prominent and wealthy man, despite the depiction of him in the Heath Ledger movie *The Knight's Tale* as kind of a buffoon. Well, I mean that actually owes itself in part to Chaucer's own kind of self-deprecating presence in his poetry. In any case, unlike the poet of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, who we believe lived in the West Midlands in Western England, and was really a creature of the court, the country house, the kind of rural domain, the castle. Chaucer's very much a poet of the city, and lived in London, and really sort of, even while he was participating in the life of the court and the higher-ups, also as a tax collector, as a controller of the wool customs, was dealing with all kinds of people through the city of all walks of life. And the Canterbury Tales reflects that. The Canterbury Tales is a frame story in which a number of different pilgrims pass the time on their way from London to Canterbury, to the shrine of St. Thomas of Canterbury, and tell stories along the way. This is the right here. Hold on one second. This here is the one of the most famous manuscripts of that contains Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. One thing I really haven't talked about that much in this class, but it's worth remembering, is that everything we've been reading so far is from the age before print. Everything that survives because it was written down by a scribe, by an author or sometimes by the author themselves, and that it was then copied by other scribes. And to own a book in the Middle Ages was to own a luxury item. Every book cost at least a flock of sheep to make, and it also cost the incalculable, well, probably calculable, but the great amount of labor that it took to hand letter all of that, and to draw in those storiated initials and do all the manuscript illustrations. And so if you were a rich person, like a merchant or a great lord, you bought a book like this, not just because you liked to read or you were like really into literature, but this was a luxury item. This was a bling. This was to show off to your friends. And I mean, John of Gaunt, one of the richest men in England in the late 14th century, had a library of something like 70 books. That's 70. So books were expensive and they were rare. So, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is a collection of stories, and it was very popular throughout the 15th century, and it continued to be read in the 16th and 17th century. Unlike the Gawain poet, and unlike the Beowulf, Chaucer was never lost and then rediscovered. He has had a continuous literary reputation and influence since his own day. And this is why he sometimes, we don't use expressions like this so much anymore, but he used to be called the father of English literature. The General Prologue begins the Canterbury Tales by establishing a frame. When does it take place? April. Where? Southern England. It conveys a scope, that kind of narrowing down that we saw at the beginning of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, that narrows in from the celestial to the tiny and the physical. Its mention of the zodiac recalls the description of spring and the cyclical nature of experiential time. This is something that links it to passages that we've looked at in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. But the idea of pilgrimage, the idea of being on a pilgrimage, which is what the Canterbury Tales tells the story of, is a metaphor in the Middle Ages for life. We are all pilgrims. We are all wanderers from birth to death, and we're hopefully wandering, according to Christian teaching, the narrow rather than the broad road towards salvation. And so every human is a stranger in this world, and they're attempting to get back to heaven, to their heavenly home. So pilgrimage recalls the unrepeatable nature both of life and sacred time. And Chaucer's poem is looking in two directions. It's looking both at this world and at the next world. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was similar in a way, in that it talked about penance and Gawain's the state of his soul, and it would note in that text the number of times that his confession is made, and think maybe about the comparison between the confession he makes to the priest before he goes to confront the Green Knight and the confession he makes to the Green Knight. Are they of the same order? Do they have the same validity? Or is the confession made for the Green Knight just belong within the confines of the game that they play together? Back to the Canterbury Tales. Here are the famous opening lines of what's called the General Prologue, or GP for short. And I'm going to read it to you in Middle English, in the way that we believe it sounded, based on reconstruction from rhymes in comparison to other languages. When that April, with his shora sota, the drocht of March hath pierced to the rota, and bathed every vein in sweet liquor, of which whereto engendered is the floor. When Zephyr sake with his sweet breath, inspired hath in every halt and heath, the tenderer croppers and the younger sun, hath in the ram his half-coursey run, and small fooles maken melodia that slepen all the night with open ear. So pricketh him natur in her courages, than longen folk to gun on pilgrimages. Now you may note that this is not modern English. This is not Old English either. Old English is the language that Beowulf is written in. This is Middle English. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was written in Middle English too, but our textbook translates that for us because it's a far more difficult dialect. The Middle English that Chaucer wrote in is the dialect that became the basis of modern English because it was associated with London, with government, with religion, with textual administration, and power. And we see that a lot of words are recognizable. Clearly you can see that when means when, April, showers. Sometimes you have to kind of sound things out and think about how they might have changed. So sota is sweet, and that's not easily perceptible, but your textbook helps you. It has footnotes and glosses that guide you. All right. What else can we say about this? This prologue, this famous proem. Here it is, by the way, in the Ellesmere manuscript. You can see Juan that April with his shoras sota. The drocht of March hath pierced to the ruta. And you might say, wow, how do you read that? And the answer is practice, grad school, too much student debt, poor life choices. Anyway, it's actually paleography is the discipline of reading old types of writing. So one of the things about the General Prologue that's so interesting is that so much is happening in this. Let me read it in modern English again so that it kind of comes through more. When that April with his showers sweet, the drop of March hath pierced to the root, and bathed every vein, that is all the roots, the plant, in switch liquor, a word that means in Middle English just liquid, of which vertu engendered is the flower. Vertu here means virtue, as in force or power. When Zephyrus, that's a mythological word for the western wind, ek means also, with his sweet breath, inspired hath, literally has breathed in, going back to the Latin root of this word, into every hill and valley, the tender crops, the young sun has in the ram his half-course run. That is to say that it's April. We're in the ram is an astrological reference to Aries. and small fowls make melody. Now, in Middle English, fowl could refer to any kind of bird, not just the kind of birds you cook, which is how we refer to fowls, as turkeys and ducks and chickens. So the small birds make melody that sleep all night with open eye. So nature pricks them or goads them or prompts them in their courages, their spirit, their heart. Then long folk to go on pilgrimage. So note the elaborate syntax of this. We get first a when April with this, blah, 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 blah. When Zephyrus also with all this is happening and all this is going on and the birds are singing. Then folk long to go on pilgrimages. There's this elaborate setup and then this payoff that brings us from the natural world to the setting, to the topic of this poem. One thing that we see in this poem is personification, used over and over again, linking the natural world to human experience. April with his showers, Zephyrus is the west wind, the young sun runs his course, nature, capitalized, pricks them. Nature is frequently personified in medieval poetry. This is where the whole idea of Mother Nature, Lady Nature comes from. But okay, so far that's so good. That's something that you recognize from medieval poetry. But we also see something that would have belonged to kind of a scientific discourse of the Middle Ages, talking about the way that the liquid in the veins of the plant engender the flowers. And so we also get natural and agricultural imagery, talking about how the showers pierce the plants to the root, and the flower is engendered. Of course, you could see that it's spelled like our modern word flower, but that comes from the same word. They've just been differentiated in spelling and meaning, but they have the ultimate root. Because where does flour ultimately come from? It comes from the flour of, wheat or whatever other, or rye or barley. More natural imagery, breath, and the hills and the heaths and the crops and the small fowls. So we have the scientific discourse, we have personification, we have natural and agricultural imagery. We also have the imagery of courtly love. We have April has not just showers, but sweet showers. And virtue isn't just a scientific term referring to the force or the power or the capability of herbs or plants, but it also speaks to a spiritual disposition or a quality. Sweet breath. In the Middle Ages, people are always talking, and remember, this is centuries before fluoride, and people are in medieval poetry is always talking about the sweetness of the breath of a lover. Imagine what a refreshing change that might have been. Tender. The crops aren't just young; they're tender, and this speaks to a soft, erotic kind of loving discourse as well as these birds making melody. And what are these birds doing in spring? Well, what birds do in spring. They sleep all night with an open eye, if you know what I mean. Nature stirs them to this. Their courage is their Freud would call it their libido, right? The courage is related to courage or heart, but they're kind of life force, right? So we've linked all these different levels of existence together, all these different ways of being in the world. And Chaucer uses this to frame then his focus on that it's at this time of renewal, of rebirth, of love, of regeneration. This is when people want to travel. This is when they want to go on pilgrimages. So if you read more of the General Prologue, which I haven't assigned that much except for, you're going to find the portrait of the wife of Bath among a number of other portraits of pilgrims all going together. And the way the larger story of the Canterbury Tales is told is that each takes a turn telling a tale, and it's a contest. If you happen to look through it, you might ask yourself how many ways Chaucer uses the word worthy, how Chaucer's style changes after the opening sentence. He actually goes to a kind of more everyday kind of writing and really brings a kind of down-to-earth, concrete way of writing into Middle English. And I when you're reading The Wife of Bath, look at the way he tries to be realistic in his dialogue and in his descriptions, and in the way that he uses concrete details to achieve characterization. This is one of his great achievements as a literary artist. He really looks forward to the kind of nitty-gritty novelistic tradition of English literature. One of the things that the General Prologues is an estates satire, and that means that it sort of makes, I'm not going to get into it here, but it sort of makes fun of each of the people that it's describing. The monk is described as the best monk. He's a worthy monk. He's a wonderful monk. He feasts really well and has really expensive clothing and has a great horse and likes to go hunting. Does that sound like a monk? And there are a number of other examples of figures who don't seem to be living up to the ideal of their reality. Though, as we're going to talk about, the wife of Bath is herself an assembly of misogynistic stereotypes, and yet literary readers and critics have agreed for a long time that there is a lot about the wife of Bath that exceeds those stereotypes, that she is far more than the sum of her parts, and one of Chaucer's greatest literary creations. And so we'll be focusing on her. I look forward to talking to you more about the wife of Bath and about Chaucer. Look for that interlineary translation that I posted if you're having a seriously hard time with the language. But as far as the language is concerned, be patient, sound it out, pretend you're a child again learning to read, and just try to have fun with it. You're getting the chance to not have it sort of spoon-fed to you, but to really sort of grapple with it on its own terms. And I hope you find this experience both fun and rewarding. Talk to you soon.